Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to give just a few seconds for people to get into the meeting and then we'll get started. All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's Recovery Summit session, Cannabis and Adolescent Mental Health. This webinar is part of the Recovery Summit series hosted each September by St. Clair County Community Mental Health in recognition of National Recovery Month. Just a few quick reminders. Today's session is being recorded and will be available on the St. Clair County Community Mental Health YouTube channel, usually after the summit is over, so probably sometime in October. Please use the chat box for any questions or comments. Our presenter will address them as time allows. For those requesting continuing education credits, please be sure to remain on the webinar for the full session and complete the survey that will be emailed to you after. We're honored to be joined today by Ken Dale from the Michigan Youth Cannabis Action and Education Alliance. And I just want to welcome Ken.
All right, thank you. Let me click a couple things on my screen here. Excuse me. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for kind of logging on today to talk about cannabis and adolescent mental health. We're going to talk a little bit about who MyCEA is, the organization that I'm working for, the alliance that I work with, a little bit about kind of cannabis itself. Then we will get into the kind of the mental health issues that we find most concerning, and then talk a little bit at the end about some resources and some things that can be done kind of in communities, whether it's by professionals who are in the field or community members, volunteers, whoever it is. We believe that there's roles certainly for everybody somewhere along the line to help out with preventing underage cannabis use. So that's us, MyCEA. This is our mission real quick. We're a statewide alliance of like-minded agencies, organizations, and coalitions working to prevent non-medical underage cannabis use. We do draw a distinction between kind of non-medical and medical underage cannabis use. As far as your body is concerned, there's no difference. If a young person is using cannabis for a whole host of medical reasons, everything that we're about to talk about is still going to happen, or is increased chances of negative consequences happening. However, we also understand that for some people, cannabis is used as a medicine, and we kind of don't have the bandwidth, we don't have the time, the energy, the resources to take on the argument of its medicinal properties and how it should be used as a medicine, et cetera, et cetera. We avoid that. What we're looking at is young people, trying to prevent young people using cannabis strictly for the mind-altering, so-called recreational purposes. We'll talk about that word recreation in just a few minutes. But that's what we're doing. We have agencies all over the state of Michigan. We have folks from the Upper Peninsula all the way down to Detroit to Grand Rapids to Alpena to Charlevoix and up the middle of the state. So we work with a little bit of everybody throughout the state of Michigan. Our approach, we understand that youth norms come from adult norms. Youth access to cannabis is related to adult access, and youth use is related to adult use. In short, we understand that adults, generally speaking, set the tone in their communities, whether it's cannabis use or what movies we watch or our education system or whether or not you're allowed to swear in public. Basically, young people will follow the lead of adults pretty much universally. So therefore, we address adult activities, adult behavior, adult understanding. We educate adults by and large with the end goal of preventing and reducing youth use. Our supporters, this is who helps us out. This is who helps not only pay the bills, but make sure that we have current information, make sure that we're networked not only statewide, but nationally, kind of with the thought leaders on cannabis prevention and underage cannabis prevention. That middle section there, the in-kind contributions in time, talent, and treasures from our partners throughout the state. We have about 135 people who receive our email notices for our meetings once a month. We have usually between 25 and 30 who are able to attend our meetings on a monthly basis. And if that's you at the end of this, if you think, hey, I kind of want to be on that list, there's an email there in a website, and that's where you'll be able to sign up and say, hey, we want to get notices about future events that MICE is doing. So we don't accept funds from the cannabis industry or any of the cannabis trade groups. We know there's a lot of local mom and pop businesses. We're not anti-business. We're not opposed to people selling what is a legal product, at least here in the state of Michigan. But we don't accept funds from the cannabis industry. For us, it just would be kind of counterproductive. We understand that by and large, people who are selling a commodity, they're there to make money. They're there to pay their bills, to pay their mortgage, and be able to buy groceries and go on vacation like the rest of us. And MICEA, we're kind of here to save the world. We have a different set of goals and some different things that we're working on. So it's not that we're enemies with the cannabis industry in any way, shape, or form. It's more like we're the competition. They're trying to sell a commodity. We're trying to make sure that it doesn't end up in young people's hands. And we do want to give credit, by and large, to people within the cannabis industry. We know it's almost impossible to get into one of the cannabis retailers in the state of Michigan unless you have the right ID and you're the right age, and et cetera, et cetera. We believe that the cannabis retailers are doing, by and large, are doing a very good job of not allowing young people to purchase from their establishments. And there's going to be a few here and there where kids can get in and young people can buy cannabis at the stores, but I believe that's the exception. I think the cannabis retailers are doing a great job. So again, we're not the enemy of the industry. We just kind of think of ourselves more as the competition. In case I say something outrageous, everyone that's involved in cannabis, whether it's kind of the pro, the anti, the prevention, the promotion, whatever it is, it's pretty passionate and pretty emotional and pretty excited field. And occasionally I do get worked up on things. And our funders at one point said, hey, can you just add a little disclaimer that says anything that I say isn't necessarily the opinion of Michigan Department of Health and Human Services, the State of Michigan Prevention Network, the local community mental health, St. Clair Community Mental Health, really any other organization other than me. It's just me talking. Certainly I work for MICEA, but occasionally I even say things that our steering committee chair has to kind of pull oh goodness, please don't say that in public anymore. So I try not to be too outrageous, but just in case I throw something out there, again, it's not the opinion of MDHHS or Prevention Network or the local community mental health who is hosting today. This is what we're going to talk about. Word about words. The words that we use, the things that we say can help young people understand the seriousness of cannabis use and some of the damages, some of the harms that come from it, or it can make it sound like it's just an innocent herb. Hey, God made cannabis, it's no big deal. So the words that we use are very important. We're going to talk about that real quick. We're going to talk about potency, because without understanding the potency, the rest of the conversation doesn't make as much sense. If you're of a certain age, I'm 55. If you're of a certain age, you can remember back in the day, people smoking a lot of weed. And if you don't understand the difference between the weed that was around in the 80s and 90s and the weed that's around today, then when you start talking about the mental health issues and cannabis use disorder and suicide ideation and some of the things that we're going to talk about, you kind of think, well, what's the big deal? A lot of people were smoking weed in the 80s and 90s, and we didn't have those issues. Number one, we did. There were just a whole lot fewer of them. And number two, we're going to talk about why that is. Why is it that there are so many more cases, so many more issues with adolescent mental illness coming from cannabis use, et cetera, et cetera. And then again, we'll wrap up at the end with some websites that you can check out to give you some additional information or to get a little more involved should you choose to. A word about words. You're going to see some different spellings of the word itself, marijuana. We use the word cannabis. If you're ever really interested in some heavy reading, just Google marijuana and racism. Way back, 100 years ago, whenever it was, when the federal government, really not quite 100 years ago, but when the federal government really started looking at marijuana, they looked at it through a completely different lens. It was a very different time. It was very much tied to recent immigrants in our country, African Americans in our country. There was a lot of finger pointing. There was a lot of just kind of bad PR, and frankly, there was just a lot of racism at the federal level, very open and overt, not behind closed doors and not whispered racism. It was very much out in the open, and marijuana played a big role in that, in how marijuana was viewed and how it was associated with kind of those people, if you'll pardon me using that language, how it was associated with certain races and was used to create fear. And distrust and dislike and hatred of other races. So anyway, we we just don't use the word. We just talk about cannabis. We understand that if you're a botanist or if you're in the cannabis retail industry or world, cannabis isn't 100% accurate for all of it, but for our purposes, again, we just use the word cannabis instead of marijuana. Where's our local dispensary? So in the state of Michigan, a dispensary is a place that actually dispenses medicine or medical care. So it's a pharmacy, it's a ready med, it's a hospital, it's a school health clinic, whatever it might be. What it is not is a place that sells a fairly unregulated herb when it comes to its dose, its amount, its how frequently should you take this for what condition. We don't see marijuana as a medicine, quite frankly. We understand, yes, there are some medicinal characteristics of it, and those are being studied, and some of them even, I mean, you know, there's a medicine called Epidiolex, which is a derivative of the cannabis plants. So it's not that we totally dismiss and say, oh, it's not medicine. The way that's being sold in local cannabis retailers, it's not being sold in a medical way. There's not a pharmacist that's saying you should use, you know, this much cannabis this many times a day for your back pain, for your sciatica, for your glaucoma, for your hangnail, for your ADHD, for your whatever it is. It's not a medicine. So therefore, our medical outlets aren't dispensaries. They're not handing out medicine. They're selling a product. And again, within the state of Michigan, the word dispensary legally, you know, the definition that goes with it, in order for you to call yourself a dispensary, you have to be dispensing either medicine or medical care. One of the reasons that word is important is, again, we don't want to send the message to young people that cannabis is a harmless commodity, you know, that it doesn't do any damage, that it's just like all the other stuff that you would find at a pharmacy, when in fact it isn't. We don't want to portray cannabis as a harmless weed, and we're going to talk about some of that research in a minute that kind of backs up what I just said, that we don't see it as a harmless weed, we don't see it as a harmless commodity, and we don't want young people to get the message that it is. So that's why we stay away from the word dispensary, and we just talk about retail outlets. We talk about weed stores. They're selling cannabis. That's okay. It's legal. It's like talking about going to the party store or going to, I don't know, the hardware store. Well, this is a cannabis store. It's a retail cannabis outlet. We try real hard to use person first language when we're talking about individuals who use cannabis. We're not here to demonize people. We're not here. This isn't a moral judgment. This isn't about they're doing something wrong or any of that. This is about health decisions. And we understand not everybody makes the same health decisions. And we all know people and love people who most likely use cannabis. So we don't talk about those people. We don't talk about the burnouts or the pot. No, these are people who choose to use cannabis. And again, some of them are people we love. They're family members, they're friends. There's people, you know, who we trust with our lives, who very well may use cannabis. So we talk about human beings. We talk about people. We don't talk about people as if they're kind of that third party, those people over there. We don't want to get into that because we just don't think it gets us anywhere. And then the word recreation, you know, what do you do for fun? We're actually up north. My wife and I are up north camping this weekend. I'm coming to you from a library in Grayling, you know. So what do you do for fun? What do you do for recreation? Some of you read, some of you knit, some of you exercise. Yeah, I don't get that one. Some of you camp, some of you hike. What we don't want to do again is start talking about recreational cannabis use, even though that's the kind of the accepted term, because again, it sends a message to young people that this is fun. This is what we do for fun. And some people do use cannabis for fun, and we get that. But the more that we associate the word cannabis with the term recreation, the more it sends a message to young people that, again, this is a harmless commodity. You know, there's no big deal. It's what you do for fun. We don't want to call it recreational use. So you'll usually hear us talk about kind of medical use and, adult use cannabis. So those are just some of the words that we use to try not to send that message again, that this is just a harmless commodity. You know, it's no big deal. It's just weed. That wasn't necessarily the truth, even, you know, back in the day, you know, for us old people, back in high school, it wasn't a harmless weed then. And it's way, way stronger than it used to be. So that's where we're going to go next is kind of the potency. I'm just going to talk for a few minutes about this before we jump into kind of some of the mental health implications. But if we look back at the 1970s, really even to the 80s and partially the early 90s, The flower, the pre-rolls, when we use flower, we're talking about the weed, right? The stuff that looks like oregano that people would roll into a joint. The flower back in the 1970s is somewhere between 1% and 4%. It was pretty weak stuff. I mean, I can remember in high school, sat at the drive-in and the guy next to us was, had rolled up a marijuana cigarette, a joint, and was smoking that. And we got to talking to him and he said something about, oh, this is the good stuff. This is 4% weed. And as kind of youngsters, we were pretty blown away, like 4%. Wow, we couldn't get that anywhere in the part of Michigan that I grew up in over by Flint. 4% was just incredible. Well, 4% today for the flower, for the pre-rolls is laughable. I mean, I don't use that for compost even. Today, the flowery stuff, again, just the weed, the stuff that looks like oregano that you stick in a pipe or roll into a cigarette, it's jumping around somewhere between 20 and 30%. Now, what you're typically going to grab if you go to one of the cannabis retailers is going to be somewhere probably between 12, 15, 18, 20%. But I'll show you some examples in a second here. There's certain blends, right, and certain kinds of cannabis that are available retail that are as high as 35%. And again, we're not talking about oils. We're not talking about shatter or wax or the stuff that goes in vape pens or any of that. We're just talking about the weed itself, right? The dried and crumbled up weed. According to weedmaps.com, and it kind of sounds interesting being on the prevention side and actually using weed maps as one of our sources, but hey, they have good information. So if you look at some of those numbers there, this was the strongest weed that was available by flower. And this goes back, I think this was like summer of 2023. So this is a couple summers ago, as high as 35%. Right. And again, this was the extremely strong stuff. This is some of the strongest weed. The flower stuff in the country was as high as 35%. So again, if we go back to, when I was in high school and it was 2 to 3% was the average, now we're talking about 35% being the strongest stuff out there, right? When 4% was the strongest when I was around, now it's 35%. So you can see, the strength has increased by almost tenfold. I sometimes, and it's not accurate, don't write this down. It's not 100% solid comparison. But if you think about, in 1985, drinking a can of Bud Light, right, just a 12-ounce can of Bud Light, didn't sound like it was a really big deal. Well, now fast forward today, and instead of drinking that can of Bud Light, imagine drinking an entire fifth of vodka, right? So we're talking about an increase in strength that's almost unheard of in any other food service and anything that we ingest in our bodies. To increase tenfold in its potency in that amount of time is pretty unheard of, right? And it's pretty wild. Vape pens, the oils, right? In the 70s and 80s, we didn't have vape pens, right? Cannabis oil probably existed then, but it wasn't something that was frequently or commonly available to most people. Today, it's not uncommon for kids to get a hold of the distillate oil or the live resin that can be as high as 95% pure THC. 95%. So again, we went in the 70s and 80s when some of us grew up, 3 and 4%, to getting a hold of an oil that you can put in a vape pen that's as high as 95% pure THC. That's a huge change. I mean, I can't underscore that enough. And again, as we start talking about adolescent mental health, you begin to understand, like, wow, why did these issues not exist 25, 30, 35 years ago? Because the chemical that we were using then, the level of THC that we were ingesting then was so much lower than the THC that's available today. So the bottom line, so this was 1980s cannabis, right? It was kind of functional. It was good looking. It was, whatever that was in 1980. Okay, that was where cannabis was. 2000s cannabis, things got a little more serious. It's got a little bit of smirk on its face, right? It's a little more muscular. You get that impression that it's like, man, I wouldn't want to meet that in a dark alley, right? So that's the 2000s cannabis. You fast forward to today, and it's ready to rip your arm off and beat you over the head with it, right? The strength and the potency of today's cannabis that young people are using on the regular, if you look at today's and look at 1980s again, you're like, wow, yeah, that's a huge difference. So from there, let's jump into kind of some of the mental health issues and the mental illness issues that are coming along with young people using cannabis. Now, I want to preface all this by saying most of the information in this slideshow is about 6 months old. Reports are coming out almost regularly from researchers who are doing, not only more study, but they're they're expanding the study. There's so many other countries where the research is maybe a step or two ahead of ours because of some federal regulations and people getting their hands on cannabis, that it's just being studied at such a higher level now. So literally today, if you were to Google adolescent mental health and cannabis, or mental illness and cannabis, or adolescent mental illness, any of those topics, you're going to get reports that have come out in the last 72 hours, articles that have just been released, reports that have just been released. So again, the information that I'm giving you isn't even the most current cutting edge. It's from about 6 months ago. Excuse me. But to me, most of what we had 6 months ago was pretty damaging as far as the image of cannabis kind of being this innocent weed, or this innocent commodity, or this herb, or even a medicine. So let's kind of jump into it. So dopamine, some of us know what dopamine is. It's a neurotransmitter in the brain, meaning it's a chemical that transfers information between brain cells. So you can imagine it's a pretty important neurotransmitter, right? Most of you have heard of like a dopamine dump. Like dopamine is one of those things that people strive after, and it's a kind of sometimes known as a positive or a feel good part of the soup that's going on, right? The biochemical, electrical stuff that's going on in our brain. So dopamine is a neurotransmitter. It's believed that mental health challenges related to cannabis use are related to the drug's impact on dopamine. So again, we have the word marijuana there, not the word cannabis, because this is exactly how they referred to it in the article that I'm using as a reference point. So anyway, it's believed that mental health challenges related to marijuana use are related to the drug's impact on dopamine. That's one of the challenges with mental health, is we understand it's a biochemical thing that goes on in the brain, right? There's some chemical imbalances, or there's some actual electrical images and electrical releases that happen and don't happen, right? And those are some of the things that lead to whether you struggle with a mental illness or not. Okay, so we're not just talking about once again, if I go back to kind of the mid 80s, our understanding of mental illness was a little bit different then. There was a lot of, it's the way the person is, or it's just what they believe, or it's just something that's kind of, it's something that they're thinking about, or it's this, or it's that. The more that we've studied the brain, especially, in the last 30 years or so, the more that we've come to understand mental illnesses have to do with chemical imbalances, right? They have to do with electrical processes that sometimes get short-circuited. They have to do with actual physical structural damage that happens in the brain. And those can happen from physical things, those can happen from physical trauma. Most of us know at least one person, if not more, that struggles with something called a traumatic brain injury, right? Which usually comes from some kind of trauma, whether it's a car crash or an explosion, somewhere in another country, is being part of the military, or whatever it is. We know a lot of folks who struggle with traumatic brain injuries. So that's the physical damage, right? And some of this, what we're talking about, is chemical damage and electrical damage, right? It's something is going on in the brain that's causing things to be processed in a very different way than people who aren't struggling with mental illness. So understand, it's, again, it's not just what people are thinking about, and if they would just get their head screwed on straight, or if they would just go camping enough, or if they would, there's so many of these, like, well, the best medicine for mental illness is just to go camping for a weekend. Sorry, that doesn't resonate. That doesn't prove to be true. The best medicine for mental illness is identifying what's causing the mental illness, and then addressing whatever that issue is. If it's a chemical issue, address it. If it's again, electrical impulses in the brain, how do we address it? If it's just a stress issue, yeah, well, going camping probably won't hurt you. But I also know a lot of people that going camping causes more stress than it relieves. So if the person is struggling with a mental illness, and the person, one of us, meaning well, says, what you really need to do is just get a good hobby, or you need to this, or you need to that. If that's causing the person more stress, then that's not helping their mental illness, right? We need to get to the root cause. We need to figure out what's causing it. Is it a trauma issue? Is it a chemical issue? Is it a developmental issue, et cetera, et cetera? So that's pretty much the best that we understand. It's believed that mental health challenges related to marijuana use are related to the drug's impact on dopamine. All right, so there's an established link between marijuana use and an increased risk of mental health disorders such as schizophrenia, depression, and anxiety in individuals who are genetically predisposed. So again, this was our best understanding 6 months ago, right? There's an established link, and then the last sentence, or the last bit of the sentence, for people who are genetically predisposed. All right, so in other words, if your family has a history of mental illness, or if you have a history of mental illness, or if there's some other genetic issues that are going on that make you more likely to struggle with schizophrenia, depression, anxiety, we know that marijuana use increases that risk, right? And again, this was 6 months ago's understanding. So this isn't when you do research, you talk about, is this a causal factor or is this correlated, right? And a causal factor means a direct cause and effect, right? If you take your fist and you punch a brick wall as hard as you can, your fist is going to hurt. That's a cause, right? The impact with the brick is what caused the damage to your hand. And then there's correlated things, right? And those are things that just happen in the same rate, right? They kind of happen because, at the same time this happens, this also happens. Okay, that's a causal effect, or that's a correlated thing. So what they're saying here is there's a correlation between cannabis use, schizophrenia, depression, and anxiety for people who are genetically predisposed. The new research that's coming out is saying this is more of a causal issue because we're seeing more and more cases of people who don't have the genetic markers for mental illness, right? They don't have a family history of mental illness. There's nobody in their background. There's nothing going on in their brain genetically or historically that would indicate they're going to struggle with schizophrenia, depression, or anxiety. But here we are. They're struggling with one of them. And oh, by the way, there was a large amount of high potency cannabis use prior to the onset of the schizophrenia, depression, anxiety. Okay, so if there's no other cause that can be identified, scientists and most researchers that are looking into this are getting pretty close to saying, no, this is a causal effect. Smoking high potency weed when a person is young is causing mental illness. And that's brand new, right? Again, these are things that most researchers weren't willing to say 6 months ago even. And now I'm seeing more and more articles out there that are saying we have identified a causal relationship. In other words, because a young person used this high potency THC, this high potency cannabis, the result is a mental illness. Okay, so it's that's not a great thing. That's not a great thing because we're closer and closer at the federal level to kind of relaxing a lot of the regulation on cannabis within our own state of Michigan. Obviously, it's legal both for the kind of the medical side and the adult use side, the non-medical adult use side. So it seems like it's being made more and more available, and yet the research, the more we research it, what we're learning is it's more and more damaging, than what we thought it was before. Really not than what we thought it was, because there's a lot of us that were pretty darn sure, hey, a year from now, we're going to be seeing more cases of mental illness among young people because of high potency THC. And now the research is bearing that out. So it's just kind of proving some of the things that's been suspected for a while. But now there's hard numbers with it. Now there's hard research. There's science behind it that says, yeah, this really is the case. Cannabis use has been shown to worsen symptoms associated with schizophrenia for those who already have the illness. For people who are already struggling, there's not a single mental illness out there that you can identify that cannabis is alleviating or lessening long term. Okay, there just isn't. It doesn't matter if it's anxiety, depression, ADHD, PTSD, whatever it is. In the long term, what they're finding is this isn't really as good as we had hoped it would be. Okay, now let me be clear. If this was a good treatment for PTSD, for ADHD, for anxiety, for depression, whether it's youth or adults, and it's not causing more problems long-term, right, then it's helping, I'd be the first one that would be saying, let's get this studied. Let's get it into a medical form where a doctor and a pharmacist can agree on things like dosage and how much and how long and et cetera, and identifying what are the side effects, right? Just like, when you get any medication that you take from a pharmacist, typically you get that, the little pamphlet that goes with it that lists all the side effects. And then it's up to you to make a decision. Do I use it? Is it worth the, the kind of what are the benefits, right? For the cost benefit ratio, right? Is using it worth the negative side effects? If I thought for a minute that cannabis use didn't have so many negative side effects in the long term, I'd be one of the first people in line saying, yeah, let's get this to people who need it, who are struggling with all those mental illnesses that we mentioned. But it's been shown to worsen the symptoms associated with schizophrenia, Okay, what about other mental illnesses? All right. Oh, sorry, we'll get to the other mental illnesses in a second. More on schizophrenia. Adolescent exposure to cannabis is associated with a higher risk of developing schizophrenia. All right. Both high and low frequency cannabis users, 12 to 18-year-old cannabis users are 6 times more likely. So in other words, even if a kid is saying, well, I don't smoke it that often, you don't have to smoke it that often. It doesn't have to be daily use. Certainly, the more you use it, the more the risk profile goes up. All right. But if you're a young person that says, I only use it a couple times a month, well, your chances of developing schizophrenia are now 6 times higher compared to people who never used it. Okay. So it's, again, if you got on an airplane and they said, if you don't use your seatbelt, you're 6 times more likely to die during this airplane ride, most of us would go, I'm probably going to put my seatbelt on the airplane. Okay, because anything that's 6 times more likely to cause damage, we're going to tend to avoid. All right, but with cannabis, this information isn't as frequently available. Certainly, when a person walks into a cannabis retailer, they're not going to find this out that, oh, by the way, if you share this with a person who's 12 to 18 years old, even if they only smoke it a couple times a month, they're 6 times more likely to develop schizophrenia. You're not going to hear that at the cannabis retailers by and large. And I will guarantee you that your sons, nieces, nephews, granddaughters, high school students that you know, I guarantee they're not hearing that from the person that they're buying weed from out of the trunk of their car outside the football or basketball game. Okay, there's this information just isn't generally available when people are at the point of sale, right? Again, whether it's a licensed retailer or whether it's some guy or some gal selling weed out of the trunk of their car, right? This isn't something that you're normally going to hear from people who are selling you this. However, at a pharmacy, they're going to be real quick to give you the brochure that says, hey, with this pharmaceutical product that you're using, right, that's been approved by the Food and Drug Administration, et cetera, here's all the side effects, right? Here's the side effects that may or may not happen to you by using this substance. We haven't seen that with cannabis yet. Excuse me. So some additional mental health issues, anxiety and depression. A causal relationship exists between cannabis use and depression. A causal relationship between them has been elusive. However, the use is associated with a higher risk of several mental health challenges adolescents experience. So again, this is, from a few months ago, this is saying, hey, a causal relationship has really been hard to pin down because it's really hard to say this one thing caused a mental illness. And this goes back, I think this research was April of 2022. So this is the research from this article that was a few years old now. However, the more we've researched it, the more we've looked into it, the more that we're looking at kind of all the other associated things that go with mental illness, stress level, genetics, et cetera, researchers are starting to find that causal relationship is becoming more and more clear. Okay, it's becoming more and more clear. And again, I'm not in a position, I'm definitely not a researcher. I'm the guy that just shares the information. I'm not ready to say there's a causal relationship because researchers haven't told me to say that yet. But we know more now, and we're very close on the research side of saying, yeah, this stuff is causing some of these mental health issues. Previous meta-analysis, and that's just where they take many research studies that are out there and they mine them for data. And they say, hey, if we have 10 or 12 research studies out there, can we put them all together and try to come up with some conclusions? So this says 11 longitudinal and prospective studies showed that adolescents who use cannabis were more likely than non-users to attempt suicide, experience suicidal ideation, and develop depression or anxiety. So again, that link to depression and anxiety, not only that, and we're going to talk more about suicide and suicide ideation in the next couple slides, but not only that, we're talking about the depression and the anxiety that typically precedes things like suicidal ideation and attempts at suicide. My son, he's 25 years old, and called me the other day. And he's a cannabis user, has been a cannabis user for a few years now. But he called me the other day, and this is down in, again, Eaton County, just west of Lansing. And he said, hey, I just heard something on the radio. I was driving in my truck. I heard something on the radio, and something the health department put out. And he said, they said that young people who use cannabis are 3 times more likely to think about committing suicide, think about killing themselves. And again, he's 25, and he said, that sounds like, pardon me, he said, that sounds like bullshit to me. He said, I don't believe that. And I said, Matt, that's what I've been trying to teach people for the last 2 years. Is young people who use cannabis are 3 times more likely to think about taking their own lives. Okay, now that doesn't always equate to 3 times more likely to kill themselves. But we also know that people who take their own lives think about it typically before they do it. It's not usually just a spur of the moment, hey, I have a great idea, let's just end it all. It's not how it works, right? There's usually thought and contemplation and planning that goes into it. And if young people are 3 times more likely to think about it, then we know it's more likely to happen. Okay, so as we talk about depression and anxiety, we're not just talking about, oh, I don't feel like getting out of bed today. Oh, I'm kind of bummed. I'm not enjoying life as much as I used to. We're talking about very real end life issues here for young people. So it does go from kind of that, when we started, we talked about the concept of recreation, and young people smoking weed for recreational purposes, just to have fun. Well, now we're talking about some real consequences, some really, really kind of going down a dark hole things that we're seeing as we research it more and more and more. So anyway, all right, we're going to move on a little bit. So cannabis and adolescent mental health, again, bipolar disorder. This is the International Bipolar Foundation. High rates of co-occurrence of cannabis and bipolar disorder, I apologize. Use worsened manic symptoms and pre-existing bipolar and individuals. So the manic symptoms, if you're familiar with kind of bipolar disorder, it's usually kind of very highs and very lows, right? And those cycle back and forth, right? A person who struggles with bipolar disorder sometimes will be very happy one day, very, very depressed the next day. And if you say, wow, what happened? There's not always necessarily a preceding something bad happened. Right. I mean, we all know if you lose a family member, it's depressing, right? If you're going through bankruptcy, it's depressing. If you lost your job, if your dog got run over by a car, there's very real emotions that usually there's something that precedes the onset of those emotions. Same thing with being happy. Hey, I just got a raise at work that I wasn't expecting. Hey, that's great news. Okay. Man, I just fell in love with somebody. We've been dating and it just, God, there's really a connect. You feel good, right? So there's things that happen that will lead to those emotional highs. Well, with bipolar, there's not always a thing, right? Sometimes it's, again, the activity that's going on, the chemical activity and the bioelectric activity in the brain. And that's what's going on with bipolar disorder, is that somehow gets short-circuited a little bit, or it's not functioning quite the same way. And what they're saying, what this research is saying, and again, the link to the article is right there on the bottom of the slide. Cannabis use worsened manic symptoms and pre-existing bipolar in individuals. The last line there, cannabis use decreased treatment response in adolescents. So young people who are in treatment for bipolar and then started using cannabis, their treatment response was reduced. All right. So even going for therapy or being medicated for it, their responses to that treatment decreased based on their cannabis use. So even people who are struggling with bipolar disorder, young people who are struggling with bipolar disorder, who are getting help for it and decide to start using cannabis to whatever, whether it's self-medicate or whatever, it messes with the treatment. It makes the treatment less effective. Again, the International Bipolar Foundation, use impacts some of the same chemicals in the brain that play roles in psychotic symptoms. So, to go from an episode of, to go from bipolar disorder to now psychotic episodes where your brain is kind of completely disengaged from reality and your behaviors follow your brain, right? So that's what we're talking about with psychotic episodes. Then it may increase the risk of new manic symptoms by as much as 3 times in people with bipolar. So yeah, again, there's no good news there. I mean, there's no good news there. Some people may use cannabis to self-medicate, or they've been told that it's a good medicine for anxiety, depression, psychosis, bipolar disorder, whatever. And honestly, it might even help in the short term. If you're a teen that struggles with anxiety and you smoke a little weed and all of a sudden your anxiety disappears for a minute. Again, I'm not opposed to young people using medicine to treat their anxiety. I think they should. However, what we're finding out is that anxiety doesn't go away, right? It comes back worse. It gets uglier and uglier. So again, with all of the mental illnesses, any mental illness that you can mention that's diagnosable, there's really none of them that long-term have been benefited by cannabis use. There's a lot of research, and there may be people on here who have struggled themselves with PTSD, or you have loved ones that have struggled with PTSD, and what I say is kind of pissing you off, and that's okay. if it's helping someone and there's not long-term effects, then it's helping someone, right? And there's no long-term effects. So it's hard to, whoops, my apologies, my screen blocked for a minute there. Anyway, back to PTSD. We don't want people struggling with PTSD. That sucks. I have loved ones who do struggle with PTSD. If we can make it go away, that's what we want to do. So if cannabis is helping them along with therapy, along with a lot of other things, it's hard to make a blanket statement that says long-term it doesn't help. It makes things worse. But the research is indicating the long-term it's not helping. It's making things worse. I think more needs to be done with it. More research needs to be done with it, and I think that we need to refine how cannabis is used to treat mental illness. But we're not at a point yet where we can say, "Hey, that's a great idea. Let's give it a try." There's just still a lot of negative side effects. Suicide ideation, I mentioned this. The result of the study indicates even people who use cannabis non-daily, right, fewer than 300 days a year, were more likely to have suicidal ideation and plan or attempt suicide than those who did not use the drug at all. And again, there's the article at the bottom, linked to where that research comes from. This is interesting here. So this slide and the next slide, among study participants who did not have a previous major depressive episode. So people who did not struggle with depression, their suicide ideation. So 3%, it occurred in 3% who didn't use cannabis. So in other words, the people who have not had a previous depressive episode, 3% of them have thought about suicide. 7% of those who use cannabis, but not daily, all right, they occasionally use, so it doubled the rate. 9% of those who use daily, okay, so that triples the rate. If you're a daily user, more than 300 days in the previous year of cannabis use, it tripled the amount of times. These are people who don't have depression, right? These are people who have not had a major depressive episode in their past. And it goes to 14% of those with a cannabis use disorder or an addiction to cannabis itself. So for people who aren't depressed, right, it increases the chances of thinking about suicide. Now, to look at the numbers of people who struggle with depression, 35% of those who didn't use cannabis, right? So if I never smoke weed, but I do struggle with depression, 35% of me, of people like myself, have thought about suicide or planned suicide. 44%, so it jumps up about 11% for those who use cannabis. 53% of those who use daily, right, have had suicidal thoughts, and about 50% of those with the cannabis use disorder. So if you know somebody with depression, using cannabis on a regular basis is going to, even using it infrequently, right, is going to increase the number of times that they think about it. If you know a young person that doesn't struggle with depression, understand that it increases the chances of them thinking about suicide even more. So whether or not a young person has depression, cannabis use increases the chance that they're going to think about suicide, that they're going to plan suicide, that, again, this term of suicide ideation. And all the research, again, is right there. I don't like reporting this stuff. I wish we had better news about how successful cannabis was at treating some of the stuff. But again, the more research is out there, the uglier it gets. So here's the bottom line. Despite popular public opinion, cannabis use has not been proven to alleviate any adolescent mental health issues. In fact, it's been proven to make matters worse for any existing mental health challenges. And again, I don't want to report that. I would rather be wrong. I would rather cannabis use is as good as people make it out to be when it comes to treating adolescent mental health. But it isn't. The more research that comes out, the more damning the research is. There's no good news that's coming out that says, hey, it's really showing promise, or if we use it this way, if we use it that way. None of the legitimate research that's out there is showing things moving in a positive direction. I want to talk just a minute about addiction, and then we'll get to resources, and then if there's any questions at the end. But when we talk about addiction, a lot of people think, well, it just means they just don't want to quit. And that's not the case. Addiction is actually a very specific medical diagnosis. There's about 11 criteria that they look at before they say somebody has a cannabis use disorder or doesn't have. It's 11 criteria. I mean, they go through, it's a question, just like when you go to the doctor, they don't automatically off the bat say, here's your course of treatment. They say, oh, let's ask them a question first. Do you have a family history of this? When did it start? When did it stop? When's the first time it happened? Have you ever noticed this before? Have you ever been treated for this before? Do you have this? Do you have that? What's your stress level? So they ask you all these questions for any medical condition that you're going to go to a doctor for. Okay, they're going to want to know what happened, what's going on with this body that is causing this medical issue. And it's the same thing with addiction. They're going to ask you a whole series of questions to figure out, is this an addiction, or is this somebody who just really likes to use weed, but they're not actually physiologically addicted to the substance. According to U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, about 9% of the people who use cannabis will become addicted, and that's about average. Most substances are pretty close. 9 to 10% of people who use it on a regular basis will become addicted to it. All right, so that's not bad. That rate increases to 17% if you start in your teens. So it almost doubles if you start using cannabis in your teens. All right, it goes up to about 25 to 50% for daily users. All right, so the bottom line, sorry, I clicked through that one really fast. Let me go back to it. 25 to 50% for daily users. Now, when we clicked on, there were about 30, 35 people on the call. What if 15 of you, what if I could tell you 15 of you are most likely going to become addicted to something, right? Whether it's, I don't know, whatever, Big Macs or tobacco or weed or alcohol or whatever. 50% of you, 17 out of the 35 are going to become addicted to using this substance on a regular basis. You pay attention to it. Okay, well, that's what we're talking about with young people who are daily users of cannabis. Okay, especially when we start talking about the higher concentrations of cannabis, that's going to hook, frankly, even faster. But the research isn't out there that says that definitively yet. Okay, almost half of our young people are at risk for becoming addicted to cannabis long term. Okay, who are using it on a daily basis. That's our young people. So the bottom line, addiction is a diagnosable medical condition. It is addictive. Cannabis absolutely is addictive. Not everyone who uses it will get addictive. So there's going to be a lot of young people will say, well, what about Billy? You know, Billy smokes it every day, and then he quit for 3 months because he was on probation, and he's not addicted to it. Yep, you're right. There's going to be a Billy in every group. If one of you is named Billy, I apologize. But there's going to be a Billy in every group who can use it and walk away from it like that, cold turkey, and not have any problems. So not everyone who uses it will get addicted. Starting to use in your teens increases the chances that you'll get addicted, and daily users are more likely to get addicted than not daily users. So, you know, again, young people using high potency cannabis and using it daily or more than that 300 days a year, they increase their chance from, you know, up to 25 to 50% of getting addicted. So we've talked about the mental health stuff. Here's some other things. Hyperemesis syndrome. If you know what emesis is, it's vomit. Hyperemesis just means you continue to vomit and vomit and vomit and vomit. There's this thing called hyperemesis syndrome. If you have any nurses, doctors, people who work in an emergency room, ask them what hyperemesis looks like, whether it's cannabis related or not. And it's terrible. Some of you would have and I've had before, the stomach flu, right? Where you just can't stop throwing up. It's terrible. I'm sorry we're talking about this, especially this close after lunch. But it for some people who are using high potency cannabis on the regular, on a daily basis, they struggle with this cannabis related hyperemesis syndrome. They cannot stop throwing up. They give them all the medicine that it takes to stop a person from throwing up, and they throw up. And the only thing that it seems to stop the hyperemesis is discontinuing the cannabis use, right? Stop smoking weed. Pregnancy and nursing. There's a lot of information out there about pregnancy and nursing. There's a lot of conflicting information. Once again, the THC comes out in the breast milk. You know, you don't want THC in a little tiny baby's body. That's just the bottom line. There's so many negative things that come with it. And there's some public health nursing groups, not nurses, nursing as in lactation groups, that will say things like, well, smoking weed or using an edible helps you relax, it helps the milk flow, and et cetera, et cetera. And that may be true. I don't know. But I can tell you that the THC is in the breast milk, and you don't want THC in a little baby's body. You just don't. Older adults and cannabis use. As we age, 10 years ago, the big thing was like, what's the fastest growing group that's contracting sexually transmitted diseases? Well, it's senior citizens, it's older adults, because we're living longer. We have pharmacology on our side now. So older people can have sex, older and older into their lives now. And guess what? Along with that, an increase in STDs and things like that. Seeing the same thing with cannabis. We have people who are living older, who are functioning at a very high level, older in life than than we used to see 25 years ago. Older adults using cannabis there's a lot of health issues that show up there that aren't present with our young people. Premature and increased likelihood of cardiovascular disease, heart disease it's increasing the likelihood of heart disease across the board. All of the research is showing, again, the more we research, the worse it gets. But yeah, so it's having this huge impact on cardiovascular heart disease. Impaired driving, a lot of people, oh, I'm a better driver when I'm stoned. No, you're not. There's also people who say the same thing about drinking. I'm a better driver when I've had a couple drinks. No, you're not. You're at a higher risk across the board. If you look at the data, THC impairs your driving in different ways than alcohol does, but it impairs your driving. There's no such thing as a safe stoned driver. It doesn't happen. There's this whole issue with fat solubility, which is a whole half-day seminar by itself. Alcohol is water soluble, right? You drink it, your liver processes it, it leaves your system, your blood alcohol content goes down, your impairment goes down. With fat solubility, it just affects your body in a completely and totally different way. That's why we don't have a roadside, blowing the thing or swab your mouth to test how impaired you are by THC, because those tests don't work the same. Your impairment in your brain is what they need to be able to measure. And I don't know how they would even do that. The roadside sobriety test will do it, but like chemically, they have to literally be able to figure out what's going on in your brain, not what's going on in your blood coursing through your system because of this fat solubility issue. Anyone here that's in medicine at all that understands fat solubility, like with vitamins and this and that, different medicines affect you different way based on whether they're water soluble or fat soluble. So it's a huge thing with THC, but again, it's a little more difficult to talk about and try to just teach in a bullet point. There are several related issues to that, to the fat solubility all by itself. Resources. Oh, if you want to know more, just learn about SAM category / Friday Fact. SAM is a national organization that's working on kind of cannabis education. They put out a Friday Fact that talks about just what cannabis is doing. In other states, it's a national organization. So a lot of the studies are from other states. How's it impacting everything from dropout rates to driving to fatalities to addiction rates to all of it. But SAM has just a ton of information. Getting It Right from the Start is another organization that's out there that talks about kind of cannabis use on the brain, cannabis use on young people. Johnny's Ambassadors. Johnny was a young man who took his own life as a result of mental illness that came from high potency cannabis use. So there's all kinds of information there. It's a family that started that organization and now it works to educate youth and adults both. Michigan.gov/CRA. CRA is the Cannabis Regulatory Agency. They're the ones that are in charge of all the licensing. So all the licensed retailers go through CRA, Cannabis Regulation Agent. Anyway, CRA, look them up if you want to know more. The CV Coalition is down in Southeast Michigan, at Mobilizing Michigan. They put together some curriculum. If you're a teacher, if you work with young people in any capacity, they have PowerPoints, they have handouts, they have all kinds of information on cannabis use. And the Michigan Prevention Association is a place where you can sign up for ongoing email alerts that have to do with prevention in general. They're not specific to cannabis, but they have to do with trainings and legislation and events and things like that. That's who I am, certified prevention consultant. That just means I do this for a living. I coordinate with MyCEA. There's my email and my phone number. So that mycea.org, if you're interested in getting information from us on a regular basis, that's where you would go to. There's a place at the bottom where you click, you can give us your email and tell us what it is that what information you want, and we'd be happy to share that with you. So that's it for my presentation. I will click off the share button and come back to the screen. And if there's any questions or answers, or if there's anything in the chat, Christy, if you want to facilitate that, and I'll sit here and try to answer any questions.
All right. We do have a question. Jenna was asking if you have any advice or research on how to best get teens to reduce use or not to engage with cannabis.
Right. And I want to go back to the beginning, what we said at the beginning. Adults play a huge role in young people's lives. I think the things that we do are going to set the stage. So number one is make sure that you're as educated as you can. If you are a cannabis user yourself as an adult, understand they're going to see that. But it's almost like using alcohol anymore. Just because I drink doesn't mean I want my kids to do it. But I better explain that to my kids, and my kids better understand why I don't want them using. If I'm not a cannabis user, same thing. I don't want my young people using cannabis, and I'm going to explain to them why I don't want them using it. The more kind of boundaries we can give young people, the better when it comes to unhealthy habits. But we also understand we can't be with them 24/7. It's that style of parenting also doesn't work. Now, there's some young people that go so far that, yeah, you're going to end up incarcerated as a young person. But I don't think that's what we're talking about here. I think we're just talking about kids that smoke weed because they think it's no big deal. Well, educate them. Go to some of those websites that I talked to and get some information. Talk to them about, hey, this isn't the same weed, that was around 30 years ago. The weed that's out there today, again, there's young people that are more likely to think about killing themselves, right? Not like having a bad day, taking their own lives. Young people are more likely to think about taking their own lives because they're using cannabis. And hopefully that can start some conversations. Keeping the lines of communication open it is huge, for us. I had mentioned my 25-year-old, he was a cannabis user when he was in high school, and it frustrated the hell out of me. But we always had an open line of communication. He knew how I felt. He knew what the consequences would be, et cetera, et cetera. But I couldn't hold his hand 24/7. So I had to make sure that he knew what he needs to know, and then take a deep breath and say, God, I just hope that kid something terrible doesn't happen. So that's kind of the best I can do. Also reach out to like St. Clair Community Mental Health. There's probably parenting classes. There's probably information that they can share, events going on there that could help educate you and educate the young people in your life about all kinds of negative stuff, whether it's, drugs, or alcohol, crime, whatever. So any other questions, answers, comments?
I don't see any other questions. A lot of thank yous and a lot of just comments about, that they're very thankful for the information and it was very helpful. So
Thank you.
I'm
I
just
appreciate
really,
that. It says there's 122 people on here. I want to give each and every one of you just a ton of credit. There's so much that you could be doing right now. And here you are. You're learning about young people in cannabis. And some of you are probably cannabis users and you're still here learning about it. Some of you are in the health field. I saw a couple names there that I recognize. So just thanks for being here. Thanks for educating yourself. Thanks for getting the information. Because that's what we need to do. We need to make sure that our information is as accurate as it can be and as up to date as it can be, and that we're sharing that information with the important people that, the people that we love in our lives. So, man, I give all of you so much credit for being here. So thank you. I appreciate the kind words and all your comments.
all right. I just want to thank you again, Ken, for coming today and sharing your time and your insight with us today. It was very eye-opening and insightful. I want to thank everyone for who joined today, this session. We hope the information was both valuable and meaningful for all of you. Today's presentation is just one of many webinars being offered throughout September as part of the Recovery Summit. For details and registration for upcoming sessions, please visit our website at www.sccmh.org under the Events tab. Also, please keep an eye out for the survey that will be emailed to you. We value your input and it helps us continue to improve and shape our future recovery summits and trainings that we offer. For those requesting McBath and peer certificates, they will be emailed out in mid-October. If you're requesting social work CEs, your certificates will be emailed to you after payment is received, if applicable. Thanks again for joining us today. We look forward to seeing you at our next session, and I hope you all enjoy the rest of your day.